Okay, we're going to talk about eugenic sterilization here. And this picture, by the way, is from a eugenic contest to find the fittest families, and we have here one of the winners sitting here displayed on the steps. Eugenics was the idea that you could improve the race, and today we might say improve humanity, things like that, improve human evolution. But a lot of thinkers at the time referred to the race, and by that they meant the white race. And by the white race, they really meant white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, for the most part. And the way to do that was through controlling reproduction. And so, in a sense, it's falling back on ideas that go back to ideas about Darwin's theory of evolution, this concept that you control reproduction. Through controlling reproduction, you control change over time and the evolution of the population. And in this particular case, they're trying to control the evolution of the population of humans. Okay, in terms of heredity, they had a very limited understanding of genetics. They did have the idea of inheritance of traits, and they could see that and do the little squares where you put the recessive and the dominant traits there and sort of see how it's going to turn out over the generations. But they understand that in a very broad way. And in general, what they did is they assumed that there was this thing called feeble-mindedness, which was a single discrete trait. And by that, they meant impaired cognition, as well as a failure of the will, a failure of innate morality. And they tended to lump together all these kinds of things like alcoholism, epilepsy, criminality, pauperism, all of them together as part of this problem of feeble-mindedness that is passed down through the generations. Favorite way of talking about this and demonstrating this is through family studies. And one of the most famous is the supposed Kallikak family. That's not the real name of the family. It's a term for Greek for good and bad. And supposedly back in the Revolutionary era, there was a man named Martin. And Martin Kallikak went out and got drunk during the Revolution and had sex with a barmaid who was feeble-minded. And then he sobered up and he got married to a worthy woman, pure-minded and of good family. And then because of that, there was this heredity of all these people who were born through his relationship with this feeble-minded barmaid who were also feeble-minded and were idiots and imbeciles and unemployed and criminals and drunkards and epileptics and you see, going on and on and on. And on the other hand, the family that came from the good side had all these very respectable people born, like judges and lawyers and doctors and all these good middle class and upper middle class people who were born. Now, the way they found out about what happened on the bad side of the family is they got it through neighborhood gossip, basically. They would send social workers in to investigate and get neighborhood gossip. They tended to get the stories about the good side of the family by going and looking at people's family histories. So you can see right there how the data would be skewed. Mostly what they're looking at are poor and white families are the ones that are seen as defective families. There are a couple of exceptions where they're looking at mixed race families, but overwhelmingly we're talking about the white poor. They chart these families' trees and then they calculate the burden of society. So many dependent, useless, defective people were born, and they have caused this amount of money in terms of how many people have been having to sent to prison and to get charity and who have had to go to hospitals and all of these things. That's the burden they have made to society. Eugenics became extremely popular And so you would have often, like, for example, exhibits at state fairs, like what you're looking at in that picture. Eugenic and health experiment exhibit where you would have go and listen to lectures, popular lectures on the subject, popular books on the subject, contests like I talked about with the first picture, contests for better babies, the best babies, contests for fitter families, the best families, all kinds of things, even movies. An important part of this was the idea that you were going to persuade the good. So these are the mothers who are presenting their babies for the Better Baby contest. And the idea is that you're going to show these mothers how it is to have better babies and bring them up. And because their ideas of heredity were a little bit more fuzzy than we're used to thinking of, they tended to also provide a lot of good child rearing information at the same time. So they would talk about things like getting safe milk, all kinds of other healthy things you could do for your child, which we today would not say is heredity. We would say that's good childbearing habits, but they sort of blended it all together. And of course, the other part of it was trying to persuade good families, middle-class families, upper middle-class families, upper families, to have more children. And then on the other side, you're targeting the bad. And we have here the menace of the feeble-minded. In this illustration, we have this feeble-minded gentleman at the center of the wheel of vice, crime, and pauperism. And you can see that he's the result of the need for a free medical infirmary, a juvenile court, a house of refuge would be a place for women who were engaged in prostitution, a jail, the police court, the workhouse for poor people, charity of all kinds, and the city hospital. So they were the cause of all these problems. More than that, the feeble-minded were highly prolific. They would have lots of children. And at a time period where it was believed that people of good family were having fewer children, the fear was that the feeble-minded were still having lots of children. And of course, the problem is that the institutions to help these people were overwhelmingly overcrowded. So what are you going to do? Well, one theory was you're going to eugenic sterilization programs that the various states passed laws to set up for sterilizing people who are defective. And this is not just an American thing. We always talk about the example of Nazi Germany, but it was done in Scandinavia, it was done in Japan, it was done in China, it was done in Latin America. Variety of countries around the world engaged in eugenic activism. Normally, what they were targeting was vasectomy and tubal ligation. Tubal ligation, so basically cutting the fallopian tubes and committing vasectomies for men. These were seen as simple operations, though let's face it, for women who were the majority of the people who were sterilized, tubal ligation is much more serious than just a simple vasectomy. I put castrations there with a question mark because every once in a while castrations keep popping up. It's officially vasectomy, but I know that they also perform some castrations in Oregon, Kansas, North Carolina, and places probably mostly used as a method of punishment and behavioral control. These laws passed across the states and spread in the years before World War II, first in the West and Northeast, but then later in the South as well. And if you look at those states in that state map, the ones with the stripes have eugenic laws, and then the ones who are black are getting eugenic laws passed. By the way, to put this into some context, Mississippi had its own eugenic law, and it is still, last I checked, which was fairly recently, on the books. Though they did remove the statement that people could be sterilized for epilepsy. I don't think it's been used since the 1930s, but it's still out there. What the terms of it were in the different states could vary pretty widely. Some of them mandated forced sterilization. Some of them required family consent. The different terms of who would be targeted would vary somewhat, but usually they targeted institution inmates. And they estimate by 1963 about 64,000 people had been sterilized. Most often, sterilization targeted poor women, though there were men who were sterilized as well in fairly large numbers. Before World War II, you're looking mostly at white people. And I think you have to see this as closely tied to fears about welfare use. And this is a time period where African American people were not eligible for getting welfare help from the state. And in fact, they were excluded, at least in the South, they weren't eligible. And in fact, they were often excluded from white charities. So the push to try to get rid of the use of people using welfare, which gets much more intense in the 1930s, is not something that's going to target women of color in this time period. Instead, it's targeting poor white women. People in institutions were those most likely to be sterilized. And we're talking about people in the very large institutions for what were called the feeble-minded. And that's the two postcards that you have there are of. But also people who were in mental institutions in these years. In some cases, women or men could be admitted for the purposes of sterilization. That could be an incentive. And in fact, if you look at institutions for people with intellectual disabilities, the real focus is, for the first half of the 20th century, is on admitting people of what was considered borderline or mild intellectual disabilities, but who were young and thought likely to get pregnant or impregnate someone, rather than the people with more severe disabilities who were usually who the families were trying to get admitted. In fact, a number of places might require sterilization if you wanted to be free from an institution. They could make it voluntary. You have a free choice whether or not you're going to get sterilized. But if you want to get out, you've got to say yes. In some cases, it was also kept secret. There were a number of people who were sterilized who didn't know about it. Strangely enough, in the case of Mississippi, I was once looking at the surgery record for the East Mississippi State Hospital, and there's, in I think it was 1939, a list of a whole series of sterilizations that were performed on women in the hospital. And they weren't performed earlier, they weren't performed later, they were performed in 1939, probably having something to do with the guy who was in charge at that particular moment in time and his own preoccupations. But interestingly enough, all of those women also had their appendix removed. And I've always found myself wondering after that, did they tell them that they were having their appendix removed, but not that they were being sterilized? Who knows? But often those operations were kept secret. 1927, the question of whether it was legal for the state to force the sterilization of a person against their will comes to the Supreme Court in the case of Buck versus Bell. Carrie Buck, it wasn't her real name, was a young woman. Her mother had been institutionalized in the State Institution for the Feeble-Minded in Virginia. She had been institutionalized as well. She was sent out on a furlough program where basically young women were sent out to work basically as a servant for households. And the idea was they were going to be trained in proper behavior by these nice middle-class, respectable white households. And these were white women who were being sent out there as well. In the South, these institutions were segregated, or often, in most cases, they didn't have institutions for Black people at that point. And while she was out at this in the Dobbs family, she got pregnant. And according to her story, she got pregnant because she was raped by the young man of the house. Giving validity to that is the fact that after she was reinstitutionalized and sterilized, her baby was taken in by the Dobbs family and raised by the Dobbs family until she died, unfortunately, in elementary school. At that point, she is proposed for the sterilization program. The argument is made that her mother was feeble-minded. She was feeble-minded, and we can, for proof of that, let's just see the fact that she got pregnant when she wasn't married. And her baby was feeble-minded. And that determination was basically made at this time when she was a very small infant. As it turns out, when her baby goes to school, she does quite well in school until she dies. So her feeble-mindedness is pretty dubious. The thing is that the Supreme Court says, just like we have the power to enforce vaccination for the good of the community, for the good of public health, we have the right to force sterilization on people who are a threat to society through their reproduction. And his famous quote is, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. In a lot of ways, the Holocaust in World War II discredits eugenics. And we have to realize that American eugenics was closely tied to Nazi eugenics. In fact, the sterilization law which they passed and which was used ruthlessly across the population, they sterilized a very large number of people, both for heredity, Jewish heredity, but the other thing, people are sterilized for things like epilepsy, deafness, all kinds of disabilities. And in fact, when you look at what happens, the initial testing of the gas chambers that are going to be used in the concentration camps are first used to test on mental hospital patients. The argument being that people like that, like the people who are being held up by that healthy workman, are a waste of resources. And in order to get the country ready for war and the changes that Hitler is making, they need to get rid of this waste of resources. And they do that by executing a number of institution inmates. So after World War II, being officially in favor of eugenics becomes much less respectable. It's much less acceptable. And it had sort of become a little bit more marginalized by the late 1930s. Some journals and organizations are renamed, they're redirected, but elements of eugenic thought still remain. It doesn't go away. The idea that there can be a benefit to directing the heredity of human beings. Institutional sterilization petered out. It declined after World War II. I would point out that though nothing I've read ever points this out, but what starts happening in the late 50s, 1960s, 1970s is people with mild intellectual disabilities or people who are not intellectually disabled increasingly are freed from institutions. And as they leave the institutions are losing the people who were traditionally targets of sterilization. So I guess part of it's this failure of eugenics. I think part of it also is they don't have the people that they used to sterilize anymore, at least not in the same numbers. We do see a pattern of sterilizations towards women of color that is often tied to the welfare system, and it's often tied to the community and rogue sterilization by physicians. And we'll talk more about that in a later week. So, sort of the conclusions, eugenics was extremely popular from the progressive era into the 1930s. And in fact, probably if you look back, people that you think highly of in that era were probably supporters of eugenics. Most of them were. They tended to have very simplified visions of good and bad heredity, and they usually targeted poor whites who were seen as damaging the race. In practical terms, except for if you look at North Carolina, which is different, the sterilization programs really targeted people who were confined to institutions. But most of those who were confined to institutions and regarded as good sterilization targets were people who were considered comparatively mildly disabled and thus likely to have children and contribute to the degeneration of the race. Sterilization doesn't go away after World War II. Instead, the practice of sterilization, who it happens to, why it happens, really dramatically changes.